last but certainly not least, we have our Tamara Clegg going to talk to us about critical data literacy issues from the high school and also College of Ed. Let's welcome Tammy.
Hey, can you guys hear me? All right, so today I have the pleasure of talking to you about a project called Data Every Day, where we are looking at critical data literacy in college sports context. So today, data analytics are used by most major sports teams to make all kinds of decisions, from who to hire and who to fire, to which plays to run and when, and to even when and where to have to hold their games. And so, as a learning scientist and an HCI specialist, researcher, this can be a really rich context for thinking about how we might promote learning, or how we might get learners involved with thinking about data and data science concepts. And so we specifically, my research team and I, we specifically look at what we call critical data literacy, which I'll talk about in a moment, in the context of collegiate sports. So we're looking at the Power 5 conferences within the NCAA. These are the top 5 conferences in the NCAA or in college sports. They operate the highest budgets annually, and they are seen as some of the most elite sports teams in the nation, if not the world. So in this rich context, it can present many opportunities for looking at data that is collected and analyzed, and thinking about how can we help athletes and really fans or anyone think about data in this really data-rich environment. In fact, if you take any given athlete on one of these sports teams. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, all right. We're on. So if you take any given athlete in one of these Power 5 Division I contexts, there's a range of mounds of data that's collected about them, from health and fitness data to data about their academics, to data about what they're eating and their nutrition, and even to film and performance data, thinking about their speeds and their power and lifts, weights and things like that during training and during games. But it's the question about how much access and engagement athletes actually have with these mounds of data. In particular, in intercollegiate context, this is also a really rich context and a really sort of needed context to think about how we might promote these types of STEM learning experiences, because in these really highly competitive environments, the safety, the well-being, and the social and educational development of athletes have been called into question, as athletes really work 2 full-time jobs on a week-to-week basis. So this actually has most significant effects on athletes in high revenue sports, where, in particular for Black men, who represents about 2.4% of the population at these institutions, but about over 50% of the sports population on their sports teams. So within this context, we're looking at critical data literacies, and critical data literacies actually are composed of 2 parts. So first, there's the part that you typically think about when we think about data analytics, data science, data literacy. There's thinking about how do you help people collect and analyze data? How do you help them to visualize it and make sense of it? And then with respect to data science, now we have access to these really large data sets. So how do we help people to draw actionable insights from these really large data sets? But then on the other hand, we also in critical data literacies are really concerned with the social side of their data analytics. So we want to help, we call that the socio-technical literacy. So we want to help learners begin to think about, who is collecting data about me? What types of decisions are they using are they making with this data? What types of stories are they telling with this data? What access do I have to my data? And how much engagement should I have with it? And then we want to help our learners begin to make their own choices with respect to their data. And in particular, we want to help them to begin to make what we call their own data productions. And so that's thinking about helping them to use their data to tell their own news stories. So we asked 2 questions within this context. First, we want to understand what critical data literacy practices are happening in these intercollegiate contexts. And then a little more complex question is, how do athletes' roles within the social, political, and historical context of intercollegiate athletics shape their access to and their engagement with the critical data practices on their teams? So taking a user-centered approach, we really want to design new learning experiences and technologies to promote this type of critical data literacy practices on sports teams. But before we do that, we really want to deeply understand the context. And so that's why we ask these questions. And we specifically started out by doing a set of in-depth interviews with athletes and staff at 2 Power 5 Division I Power 5 universities. And so we interview athletes across 10 sports and athletic staff across these sports as well. And we did these rich case studies with this data. So we really want to understand specifically with athletes, what was their access to and engagement with these practices. And so we outlined we found several types of themes with respect to athletes' reactions to and engagement with their data. And so what I'm going to do today for sake of time is I'm going to present to you 2 cases that represent 2 very diverse or 2 of the most sort of opposite extremes of the cases that we found. So I'm going to introduce you to these athletes, and I'm going to walk you through their story with respect to critical data literacy. So first, I want you to meet Lee. Lee was a senior middle distance runner on the track team when we interviewed her. And the theme for her case was that she was fighting back for life balance. So Lee recognized that, like, in this really competitive environment, you got to start counting the little things, right? So she said, I have to be very in tune with my data because it's so important for helping me to win matches or to win races. So she said, she took a lot of data with respect to her performance. She wore her running watch, and she collected her pace data and things like that. She collected data about her exertion. She looked at things like her heart rate. But then she also was really attuned to what we called her felt data. And so that's like how she actually felt during a run. And so she looked at these aspects of her data, and she actually compared them over time so she could see, you know what, when my pace stays the same and my heart rate is getting lower, but I actually feel good. I feel better, right? She could tell that that was an indication that she was improving in her running. And so while she was very attuned to this data, she also had some tensions with respect to thinking about how it was used in athletics. So she recognized that athletics was a business. And she said she recognized that sometimes the priorities of athletics didn't always match with her long-term health goals. And so she saw this as she began to look at things like or see examples of burnout and injury on her sports team and in other sports at her university. But she also talked about how in track, especially with women's track, that eating disorders abound. And she was very concerned about these eating disorders. But she observed, you know what, if you come in from the summer and you drop like 30 pounds and you look, in a normal human's eyes, like a little skeleton, but you're running amazing, it's usually not addressed. She said, you're performing, it's a business. The coaches are like, okay, well, she's our new number 1 girl type of thing. And so she realized that in this environment, she had to really be attuned to how she was and wasn't going to participate in data practices. So we saw then in Lee's case that she began to make her own data productions. She began to think about which practices she wanted to avoid and which practices she couldn't negotiate. So she specifically talked about how she avoided sharing her data with her coaches and teammates when she was recovering from injury because she knew that would make her take her training back too fast and potentially risk being re-injured. But she also talked about how she avoided anything close to counting calories. So she just did not want to go down that path of getting towards an eating disorder. And then at the same time, she also talked about these practices that she could negotiate. So she talked about how occasionally her coaches would set the speeds for their training runs a little too fast or a little too slow. And it's interesting because unlike the picture here, which shows her kind of really standing up to her coach, this was a little bit more subtle. So she talked about how what happened is that it wouldn't be a conversation that she'd have with her coach or anything like that, but she and her teammates would look at each other and they would just decide to collectively start running faster if the speeds were too slow or start running slower if the speeds were too high without ever saying anything to the coach. And so our analysis really suggests that the reason that, or one reason that Lee may have had the power to actually create these data productions was because she actually prioritized other aspects of her, other non-sport aspects of her identity. She said, because I've seen the eating disorders, I've seen what happens if you put your identity in your sport, you don't care about school, so it's all about balance. And because she had that balance and this focus on her academics and focus on her faith and things like that, she was able to say, you know what, it's not all about my sport and I'm not going to take certain risks. So now I want to introduce you to Omar. So Omar was a junior linebacker on the football team when we interviewed him. And Omar's case was more about this sort of deference to athletics. So Omar talked about how, or we saw in Omar's case, how the extensive staff that was on the football team actually positioned Omar a little bit further away from the data practices. So while all other athletes talked about how they had to actively, during training, during weightlifting and things like that, they had to record their lifting and they had to record what they were doing. Omar said, we don't have to take any lift cards or we don't have to record any lifting measurements or anything like that. We have 4 strength coaches and 2 interns. They do it for us. And so these practices or this extensive staff could sometimes limit his access to the data practices. And in fact, when my collaborator asked him, who was in charge of his data, he said, the coaches are in charge of my data. And he specifically talked about the strength and conditioning coach because the strength and conditioning coach actually determined what software they were going to use and and what data they were going to share with the software companies and what data he would share with coaches and things like that. And it was interesting because even though Omar talked about concerns that he had with respect to his nutrition and concerns that he had with respect to injuries, his own injuries and other injuries of his teammates, it was his coaches that he deferred to actually help him to mitigate these injuries and to think about what his nutrition. But there was one aspect where he was deeply, deeply engaged in data analytics and thinking about his data. And that was with film. So we got to the end of the interview, and up until then, Omar had been kind of reserved. But at the end of the interview, he asked, does this film count as data? And my collaborator said, of course it does. And Omar just lit up. And so he really went in depth after that. And he began to talk about how he has a lot of scaffolding from his coaches with respect to film data. So he said his coaches actually break film down by which plays and which personnel, meaning which athletes were running those plays. And they actually watched it closely with him. And he said, the coaches help us to understand our patterns. They help us to understand what mistakes we're making and how we cannot make those mistakes. And they help us to understand our opponents and their tendencies and what patterns they might be exhibiting during a game. But Omar said, you know what, though, at the end of the day, the big thing for me is that I've got to take all this data and I've got to read my key. And so Omar said his key was, for him as a linebacker, he had to look at his direct opponent and he had to look at the positioning of his shoulders and he at the line of scrimmage, and he had to look at the positioning of his hips. And he said, based on that data, I have to correlate that with understanding what my mistakes are, understanding their patterns and their tendencies. But if they don't match, I've got to prioritize my key in split seconds in the middle of a game in front of thousands of fans. So we see from our analysis that this context, this intercollegiate sports context, specifically looking at Power 5 context, gives athletes extensive access to socio-political aspects of their data. And our analysis suggests that the athletes do find ways to navigate these practices, but some athletes have more agency and power to negotiate these practices than others do. And in fact, our analysis suggests that the organizations of athletics institutions actually drive the data practices on their team. So the practices that an athlete can and cannot or does or does not engage in can be driven by their role on their team. It can be driven by their team's role within the athletics department at their university. And it can also be driven by the larger governing bodies like the NCAA or their Power 5 conferences. So with this understanding, our next steps then are to begin to think about and co-design with athletes how we can help them engage in more of these critical data literacies. So we are developing a mobile app that is called Data Goat. Data Goat. Our logo was designed by Nicholas, and this app is going to help athletes to collect their data, to actually clean it, to visualize it themselves, and to produce their own data stories. But we also recognize that the athletes are not going to just do this with just a tool, but that we also need to provide them with the social support to help them to begin to do this. So we're going to have data mentor tables. And so that will be where we have mentors in data science education and sports science who will help the athletes to negotiate and navigate this data and figure out how to negotiate practices on their teams. And so hopefully they will be able to create these new data productions that they can use for all sorts of things. So, and for their training in their sport. So with that, I would like to thank my amazing collaborators, including Nicholas Elmquist, who is here in the room. And I would also like to thank the athletes and schools that we work with. And I would like to thank my cousin, Ricky Clegg, for doing those amazing graphics illustrations of our athletes to preserve anonymity. So thank you all. We'll open the floor for questions.